A lot of times when I talk to people about teenagers, people will say, oh yeah, they're the leaders of tomorrow, but teenagers are the leaders today.
Welcome to the Extraordinary Lives podcast, where we talk about lives that go beyond the ordinary to the extraordinary, with the extra being Jesus. We'll be encouraged with amazing stories and helpful insights from the lives of ordinary people who have that extra, that supernatural difference that only Jesus can give. I'm your host, Ellen Bennett. Thanks for joining us. Hi, everyone. I am thrilled to welcome Yaneth Diaz, who is on staff with Cru's high school ministry in Houston, and her good friend Debby Minell, who is on the Cru high school ministry in the Twin Cities. So welcome to the show. I'm so glad you can be here with us. And we're especially here to talk about Yaneth's story, to hear about what she's up to in Houston, impacting lives there. So welcome. Tell us a little bit about what you're up to now, just kind of a brief introduction of what you two do.
Thank you, Ellen, for having us on your show. We're so grateful, and I'm really humbled to be a part of this. So, yeah, I'm Yaneth, and I live in Houston. I've lived in Houston all my life, and currently I am helping lead the team here. I've been leading the team for about 4 years now, and we're a strong team of 3 women and 1 young man who is in college. So that's really fun and exciting, and the Lord's just been doing really great things to impact the lives of middle school and high school students here.
That's fun to know it's middle school as well. That's really wonderful. How about you, Debby?
Well, my husband and I, we work in Minneapolis, South Minneapolis, in the inner city. So we are reaching students that are often overlooked and in really struggling situations. And it's been really a blessing. We're pretty new, just moving back from New York. Oh, not even 2 years yet. So.
Okay. And what area of New York were you in?
Well, we lived up in Harlem for most of the time, but we kind of worked all over the city at different churches and schools.
Okay, great. Well, in my earlier podcast with Susie Berner and Sue Smedley, I mentioned the impact that Cru's high school ministry had on me because as a new believer, I got involved with what was then called Student Venture, Cru's high school ministry, as a volunteer, discipled by Kim Mikesell and some of the other wonderful people there on staff. So that has really made a big impact on me. And it was fun to see how Cru's high school ministry works to really impact students to win, to build, and send. And I love those aspects that you're learning about evangelism, reaching others with the gospel message. You're learning about just growing in Christ and in this new relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And then how do I then impact others with what I have come to learn about the Lord? And that has just been put into me. How can I help put that into others? So I love this ministry and grateful for your service to that.
Thank you.
So, Yaneth, tell me a little bit about your family of origin and also your family now.
Yeah.
Plus, how did you even become a follower of Christ?
So I'm originally from El Salvador. I was born in Central America, and I came to the US when I was 4 years old. My mom and my dad immigrated here. First, my dad immigrated to the US, and I was born during the time of the Civil War in our country, and it was at the beginning of the Civil War. So there was a lot of danger, violence, and poverty, lack of jobs, and just instability. My parents come from very impoverished backgrounds, so there wasn't a lot that they could do, and losing their jobs. So some of my family, or my dad's family, had already immigrated to the US, to Houston, and encouraged my dad to come. It took him a while to get to the US, but after being here for a while, then he sent for my mom and I. And that was a journey in itself, traveling to the US as an immigrant. I don't remember the journey that much, except for like pieces of it, since I was 4. I just remember being one of the only kids in the group and having to be very quiet. I remember one of the things that really impacts me is that when my dad was immigrating here during his stay in Mexico, there was a missionary family that lived there and would see him sleeping around some cars and invited him to stay with them. So he asked them, when I get my family to come, would you, host them? And so they hosted us at their home, and then we walked for hours to the border and then crossed the river and came to the US. And the first place we came to was Houston. And so this is where we established and have built roots. There's a lot of
Wow.
story within that I know some people, probably will wrestle
Yes.
with, and some who, think of the political aspect of that. But I think about my mom's journey and how she would do anything as a young mom to survive and have a life. In fact, my mom didn't even know that she was going to be walking. She's like, I wore heels because I thought that it was, we were just getting on a plane, and then realized she didn't. So
Wow.
one of the guys that she was traveling with sold her some shoes to walk more comfortably, though she said she had a lot of pain afterwards, either way, on her feet. So I think about that, and I think about just the sacrifice that my mom made in order to really for us to survive and live, and even just to give us a better life. A lot of it is, sometimes people will wrap it into the American dream, but now that I know the Lord, it's not that. It's not the American dream. It's just a better life that Jesus wants for us, So not that I couldn't have had it in El Salvador. It was just not the time, the season and the circumstances. But I'm grateful that he allowed us to come to this country that we love, dearly, and this is where I met Jesus. So my mom came to know the Lord during that time that my dad was away, and she just fell in love with him and dedicated her life fully to him. So the first thing she did when she came to the US was find a church. And at that time in Houston, there wasn't a lot of Spanish speaking churches. So it took a little while for her to kind of, hop around to find a place. They did have some churches that had like the headsets and stuff for translation, but it's not the same. So
Yes.
she eventually found a small church plant, and there she really established roots. She still goes to that church today, and we went there for many years ourselves. And so there is where at 7 I heard about a Jesus who wanted to rescue, who is a rescuer. And at that time, I was going through some difficult circumstances within our family and just the nature of our life and the circumstances we lived in. I didn't realize or recognize until I was older that we were poor and that we were an immigrant family and that, there was a lot of discrimination and a lot of other issues. I didn't realize that until later because thankfully we had what we needed. But my mom was very much dedicated to faithfully sticking with Jesus. And so at the church is where I heard, I didn't understand what that fully meant until I was like 18, 17, 18. But I was 7 when I first heard this teacher explain that Jesus wanted to rescue me. And at that time, I understood it as a physical rescue, right? Like he physically wanted to rescue me. And that's true too. But later I understood this, spiritual and emotional need for him and the rescue of sin, really. But I didn't understand that at 7 until later on. I was able to understand it and better dedicate myself to following who Jesus is.
That's great. So tell me what happened at age 17, 18 that helped you understand that message better?
Yeah, I feel like I graduated high school and it was a little bit easier. I wish I would have had something like the ministry that I'm on staff with now to guide me. I had great people at church, but we went to a really small church that if you wanted to do something, you had to do it yourself because there was just nobody else on staff to do it. So, but I do feel that that is where my roots really began and started to really deepen because they taught me about the Bible and discipled me. And I think that I didn't fully understand discipleship until I was about 17 or 18 years old. And I got connected into a small discipleship group at our church. And I started to dig into scripture better and made better decisions. School, I never got into like trouble or anything, but I still felt like I lived a divided world where I followed Jesus at church and dedicated my life to him. But at school, it was just difficult to implement both worlds. And so that's the great thing about the ministry that, Debbie and I get to do is that we get to help students figure out how to really implement Jesus everywhere they go, not just, when they're at church or when they're at Cru or when they're at a Bible study, just bringing Jesus into your whole world. And so that was really something that I began to see. And I think I was making more decisions that were on my own too. It became my own faith, not just my mom's faith. And so, started to go to college. I am the first one in my family to graduate from college. And then after that, both of my brother and my sister are both professionals as well. And I really attribute that to my mom's dedication to prayer. I know that she really dedicated herself to praying. My parents both come from backgrounds of poverty and violence, and they didn't go to school, they didn't finish school, but yet they had that really as a value for us when I came to the US to finish school. It was interesting because like my dad, when I graduated and then eventually came on staff, he was like, I really thought that you were going to be a secretary. Later I understood that it's because in his time in his country, secretaries were the job that a woman could have that was like a really high position. But I'm glad that the Lord called me, of course, to staff. And I'm glad for everyone else that's called to be a secretary, which is great too.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. So tell me a little bit about how you did come on staff with Cru's high school
Yeah,
ministry.
so, I wasn't involved in Cru at all, and I didn't even know Cru as an organization, Campus Crusade for Christ. And later on, I discovered from our pastor back then that most people in our countries, Latin America, would know it as Campus Crusade for Christ in Spanish if you went to college. And so, of course, I didn't come from a background where I had anyone in my family who went to college, so we didn't know anything about Cru. And the church that I went to was a most immigrant church. So a lot of the people that went to our congregation were people who had been like my parents and I, had come here, were first generation immigrants and were labor workers or day workers, or like my mom, a housekeeper. My dad, worked at a car wash and dishes at a restaurant. So I didn't have that familiarity. So it's interesting that in our countries, it would be mostly people who went to college. So even though I was living this life of not fully understanding my faith, I still was very involved in our church and wanted to do stuff with youth. And in the smaller churches, we didn't have a youth pastor and all the different staff that could happen. If you wanted to do something with the youth, then you had to make it up yourself. So I was given that position of like, hey, you help the youth. And I was only 15. So I was like, what am I doing?
Wow.
And so I developed this desire to serve teenagers and as a teenager myself. And eventually, when I graduated and I understood my faith better, I started to take some courses. I was going to college, the University of Houston, and then I was also taking a course in youth ministry at our local biblical college. And they talked about parachurches, organizations that come alongside of the church. And the only one that stuck was Campus Crusade. And so I went to the professor and I asked about Campus Crusade, and he was like, I don't think you would like it because you have to raise your own support. And I was like, okay. And I smiled and pretended like I knew what he was talking about because I didn't know what that meant either. And so I went home and I looked it up. And, again, you don't really think about these things until later, but my parents didn't have the finances to get internet at that time, right? And so we would get these free AOL 30-day coupons in the mail. And so I would always do the AOL free thing. And so at that time you had to plug it up to the landline and and you'd be like, don't pick up the phone,
Yes.
And so I'm Googling, well, no, it wasn't even Google. I don't know what it was. I was searching
Yes.
and I searched up, Campus Crusade, and I was like, oh, this is a big organization. I thought it was like a local Houston. And no, it turns out it's this massive international ministry. So in my search, I looked up and eventually found Student Venture, which was what it was called back then. And I applied to see if I could be a volunteer. And it was a really long application. And it took me a really long time with that type of computer. Imagine that, any young person that's listening out there, it was very slow. it turns out, I was like, wow, they really are serious about their volunteers. Where later I found out that I filled out the staff application, not the volunteer application. So that's why
Oh my goodness.
that's why they
That is
needed like
so
6
funny.
references or something crazy. But eventually, through some connections, some people connected me and said, oh, we know the people that work for Student Venture locally. And through one of the professors of the class, he ended up being an intern with a Student Venture. And I told them, I was like, oh, I applied for this, random organization. And he said, I'm an intern with them. I was like, oh, okay, well then can you connect me with them? And so I didn't think anything would come out of that long application. And that's just how I got involved. And I eventually, after graduating college, I went to an event that they hosted, and I heard the Lord called me and say, whom shall I send and who will go for me? And I responded like Isaiah here, I want to go. And I had always had a desire to serve teens, especially teenagers that had dealt with a lot of the similar things with me. So for about 12 years of my ministry, I did inner city ministry as well, in mostly areas like places that I had grown up in and similar situations, students that have similar backgrounds as myself.
Wow, that's fantastic. I love how the Lord seemed to lead you in that direction, and that you would meet an intern with Student Venture is pretty amazing too.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit before we get too far away about your family. I'd love to know
Yeah.
about your family now.
Yeah, so I'm married to Ricky, who is, I believe, is an actual gift from the Lord. I really think he is just God given and humbled to be married to such an incredible man. We met at church, at the church we went to, and we were friends for a really long time before we even started dating and eventually got married. And then I have 2 kids, Natalia, who is a 13-year-old. So it's interesting to have a teenager and work with teenagers. Totally different,
Yes, it
I thought, oh, it'll
is.
be the same. No, it's not. And then I have an incredibly extroverted son who is Elazar, and we call him Czar, and he's 8. And he's just graduated 2nd grade, going into 3rd grade, but
Wow.
definitely thinks he's 15 or 16. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. How fun. And you mentioned that you are about to lead a group to the DR, the
Mhm.
Dominican Republic. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is such an incredible year for our ministry. This was actually a dream that had been given to some of our staff that lead us in, and it was supposed to be in 2020, which was, the year that nothing really happened with us traveling. And so the goal, the dream was to get all of our ministries together from around the nation and worship and serve and train and equip students, as well as share the gospel with new students who come and are seeking or are interested in faith. And maybe some who are not interested, but are just maybe trying to hang out with their friends. But we're so grateful for them as well. And so we're going to have all of our ministries together from all around the nation. And then from there, the dream was to have students go off into the world, teams go off into the world and share Jesus in those countries. And so this year, we have 11 teams. Debby is actually going to Thailand. She's one of the leaders leading to Thailand. And then I get to co-lead with another person going to the Dominican Republic. Our team is about 41 of us. That includes students and staff and volunteers, college students, and we get to go into partnering with Compassion International, and they have teenagers that they serve at these 2 different centers, and we'll get to equip and train and also share the gospel with these teenagers. And then we're also partnering with Filters of Hope, which brings clean water to some of the communities that need it. In the DR, it is known that, they don't use the water that the city provides. It needs to be filtered or bottled water. So it'll be definitely a blessing to be able to, bring this to them, as well as share the gospel with them, the families that invite us into their homes.
That's wonderful. Are you all meeting together and then heading off to your separate countries?
We're
And it
going to
sounds like one is Thailand, one is the DR.
Yes, there's 11 different places.
Okay.
South America, there's a country in Africa, New Zealand. Go ahead,
We're
Debbie.
actually going to every every continent except Antarctica.
Yes,
My
every continent. Yeah, that's a
goodness.
great way of putting it.
Wonderful.
Yes. We're going to be meeting in California at Azusa Pacific University.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, we get to be there, hopefully between six and 700 students, staff, college students,
Great.
and, have a really great time of just learning and sharing the gospel and equipping the students who are going to be going on mission. And then there's about over 200 of the 11 teams that are going.
Great. And how long will the students be in each country?
Yeah, every country is different. I think like Thailand is about a month. And then for ours is 2 weeks. And of course, the cost is different depending on where and how far you're going.
Sure. And that's a big commitment for a high schooler versus a college student. I know they have different missions for college students as well, of course, but what a wonderful opportunity.
Yes. Yeah, it's so incredible. In fact, the Thailand team has, I believe, 3 or 4 middle schoolers that are going with them, which is, oh, 5 middle schoolers that are going with them.
Five middle
Yes.
schoolers.
I know. So that's
Wow.
really incredible. I think just the step of faith of the student applying, because in the case of the conference that we're going to California, everyone can join. But in the case of going with us overseas, they do have to go through an application process. And that's just really to see where they are with their faith and maturity level, and to really see if they're really dedicated to something like this, not just like, oh, I'm going on vacation. And so
Right.
it's really exciting that they even take that step to apply, because they have to apply and fill out, get some references, so it's like a job, right? And so even that step, when I've gotten to talk to the students that are going, I just encourage them, like, wow, just thank you for even taking the step to listen to Jesus and be obedient to this call and apply to join us. And then, be committed to raising the support that they need, because, not only the conference costs money, but then going overseas to any of these countries, they cost money. And so they have to raise their own support, which is they need to seek people who will sponsor them or fund them or give them gifts to be able to do it. And even last night we were in a call, and it was just exciting to hear the students where they're at. Some are just beginning that journey of asking for the support because it's very scary. And
Yes.
then some are already ahead. One of the students was sharing how she's fully funded, but she's getting, people are still asking her, can they give? And she said yes, because there's other people who still need. And so it's great to hear just her kindness and compassion to be like thinking about her teams who she doesn't know personally, but she knows that she's going to serve with them. So that's exciting, to see the heart of these students. A lot of times when I talk to people about teenagers, or they talk about teenagers, people will say, oh yeah, they're the leaders of tomorrow, but teenagers are the leaders today. They can lead today. We don't
My
have to wait
God.
until tomorrow or years from now for them to lead. When you read scripture, many of them were teenagers. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a teenager herself. That God, the creator of the universe, would pick her at such a young age to hold his child was a huge commitment and a responsibility. And so teenagers are definitely capable of leading today. So we're excited to be able to be a part of this ministry that gets to equip those and then train them, and then also share the gospel with those who are God has designed to also lead in some form.
That is fantastic. I love that. And I have to say my hat's off too to the parents who are allowing their students
Yes.
to go on this mission to be
Yeah.
trusting the leaders and God in that too. So thank you, parents.
Yes, I agree.
And so I just have to ask, Debbie, do you have any students from your area, the Twin Cities, going? And Janet, do you have any students from your area going on this?
So I do have a kind of a fun story with that. We have one student. When we came to the Twin Cities, we were less than 2 years and starting a ministry. So Dan and I had basically just said, I just don't think the students are at a place to do this step, to go overseas. But it was sad for us, right? But I had a call a few months ago from a friend who I've known since she was 16 years old. And I met her as a 16-year-old high school student, and she had just moved to Orlando, Florida, where I was on staff, and her friends drug her to Bible study, and she would sit there and snarl at me during Bible study. But slowly over time, I got to know her, and we would take walks together because she lived near me, and her heart began to soften, and she began to really walk with the Lord. And the next year, she had decided to move from her mom's house to go and live with her sister back in New York City. And, so she was living in abject poverty, finishing high school there. And Dan and I were getting ready to lead a summer mission to East Asia. And the Lord just kept burdening me that I needed to invite her to go. And so I did. And she just said, I mean, I'd love to go, but there's no way I could go. I have no money. And I talked to her about trusting God, inviting others to join with her. And she said, okay, I will trust the Lord. And there's many times I had to talk her off the shelf, and God had to meet her. And God began to do some incredible miracles. Like I could sit and tell stories, but in the end, she ended up raising $1,000 more than she needed and was able to help other students on the summer mission.
Wow.
So she called a few months ago and she said, God has burdened me for one of your students to go. And she goes, our family would like to cover that cost. She's now married with 3 children.
Wow.
So Dan and I began to pray, and I reached out to a young lady that God made it very clear that she was the one to ask. And it's so beautiful because I initially was hesitant to ask her because she holds things very close to her heart. It's hard to get to know her. She's just learning to trust little by little. But through this process of journeying with her in preparation for Thailand, I just seen her blossom. And I kid you not, like this serious girl that hardly cracks a smile when she talks about telling teenagers in Thailand about Jesus will glow. Usually she's got this serious face, and then I talked to her about this and her face changes. I can't wait
Wow.
to see what God is going to do in her heart this summer. Like Janet, we have a big team of 30 people, and we're excited. From the oldest
Yes.
Cru high school staff, almost 80, down to the youngest students in middle school, all boys. We have a crazy team, so it'll be amazing.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. A very exuberant team, it sounds like, with
Yes,
those middle school
yes.
boys especially. That's great. And Janet, how about you? Anyone from the Houston area going?
Yeah, we have a college student who serves with us, going with us. And I met him as a sophomore in high school, and I was super impressed with just the way he talked and his wisdom at such a young age. And I invited him at that time to be one of our student leaders. And then eventually he led through his high school years. And then recently this year, he joined as an apprentice with us. We have this apprentice program, which we raise the money and pay college students to give about 10 hours a week to serve with us. And so he's back serving at the school where he graduated from and discipling other boys. So he's going to be joining us. He speaks Spanish. He says, it's not my best Spanish. He says, but he speaks Spanish. And so it'll be great because a lot of the students that we're going to be working with are they don't speak any English. And so it'll be great because he'll be able to communicate with them. And he's a really great speaker from up front and stuff. So I think he's going to do a great job. And then we have another student. Her name's Kimmy. She is one of the students at one of the high schools that we're at, and she's going to be joining us. She is a great young woman. Like, she took off with how she decided to raise her funds, and she was fully funded within a few. I don't even think she had her passport, and she was already funded, and she continues to raise money. And so she's really on fire. And next year she'll be one of the student leaders at one of our campus. So I'm excited to really work with her and partner in this. And she is great. So I can't wait to see what the Lord does. She's really trusting God to do this instead of doing basketball over the summer, and because she's a basketball player. And so this is really another story of how some students are trusting God, instead of doing things that maybe would help her with college or everything, but this is just as important to them, or even more important to them to do. So I'm excited to see how he uses her in the DR.
That's fantastic. I'm thinking about a few things. One, I was doing this study in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John by Jen Wilkin, and I really recommend the study. It was so good. But in 3rd John, he talks about how we are able to really partner with others
Mm,
to take the ministry to the world. So when people are supporting financially and with prayer these students, they're really part of that work themselves. And that's so exciting.
Yes.
And then beyond that, it just is wonderful for that student to have that team. So even though it's hard to ask people for money, it really is serving everyone in the community. Everyone is getting to participate in this and cheer them on and be a part of what God is doing. So I love that.
Yes.
Janet, I'd love to hear more about your ministry in Houston. Tell me about what you're up to there. And I know that you have a really neat program that you've started as well that I'd love for you to share about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I've been on the team here for since I joined staff. So I know sometimes people come on staff and they travel to different cities, but I've been able to stay in the same place where I grew up. So that's been pretty fun. And the first things I wanted to do when I joined staff was, really go back to students with similar situations that I grew up in. And so I was able to work with inner city students for about 12 years. But as I've moved up in my career with Cru, I've had different positions, and so I've had to navigate different things and now help lead the team. And at first, it was just an interim position, and I was a little bit like, I'm not really sure this is for me. I had a different position that I really enjoyed, but the Lord was very clear about it. And I think one of my biggest fears was just our team had shrunk and it was small, and living in a massive city like Houston with over 30 independent school districts was like, in over all those 30, there's several schools, middle schools, high schools, and of course elementaries. So it's just feeling like, wow, this is an overwhelming scope. And so I wouldn't just be at my campus, I'd be thinking about the scope of Houston. So that was really nerve wracking. And then also the finances, because, joining staff when I first came on, it was, like I said before, Cru was foreign to me. It was like, I've never heard of Cru. My parents had never heard of Cru. The people that I would lived around and had community with had never heard of Cru. So here I am now being told that I need to raise my own financial support to be able to maintain, so it's really like when you do your own business, right? You're trying to figure out where your money is coming from and grants or loans. And so I already had a hard time raising my personal support. And so now I'm going to be responsible for the city, which means the schools that we're going to be at. And I was just like, I don't know about that. So thankfully I had some really great mentors that are like, we're going to walk alongside of you and we're going to encourage you and stuff. One of the things that, after the Lord was very clear about joining, and he definitely through scripture, he said that this was something he wanted me to step into and just trust him. I learned very quickly in this 4 years that still it's a very male dominated ministry. Yeah, most of the people that do ministry tend to be men, or at least in the spaces that I'm in. And even our training was really geared towards, how to raise funds towards businessmen. So that was already really, okay, interesting, trying to figure that out. And then here I am as this young woman, but not only am I figuring out what this means, but also I am a brown woman. And so that comes with its own layers of things where there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of things that I don't know. I don't come from a middle class background. So there's a lot of things that I felt very ignorant to, very unaware, very nervous about stepping into. And so I already knew some of these things, but now I was beginning to fully experiencing them, right?
Yes.
Now I'm not just raising support for myself, but I'm raising for the students and the city and scholarships. And then it ends up that all of our team is women. So then it's like,
Wow.
here we are, just women working and having to navigate most spaces with when it comes to ministry and churches and partnering with people tend to be men. And so I began to really be confronted with some of the unfortunate things in ministry where I've met with men and they've questioned my age, they've questioned how I look, not like nonchalantly, like very bluntly,
Wow.
and very inappropriately. And, you feel like nobody else is here to hear this information but me. And so then you feel very alone. For me, I felt very like, I am not good enough to lead this ministry. Like, why are all these men asking me these questions? Why am I not able to raise this money? I hear stories of people, and I left this meeting and they supported me this much money. And I'm like, that is not my story. That is not who
Wow.
I am. So it just became very hard. And so thankfully, the Lord provided people like Debbie and Jeanette and some other women, including women on my team, who helped me to reject the lies of those things. And also, they said, yeah, what these men did is wrong, because sometimes it's
Yes.
like you're gaslighted into believing, like, did I do something wrong? Did I say the wrong thing?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, and for me, there's been times when I've been sitting in these meetings and I try to be as professional as possible. But when they start saying things that you're like, is this because of me? Is it I'm not representing Jesus well? I'm not representing Cru well? And why can't I raise this money? Like, I'm just not
Right.
good enough to lead this ministry. And so all the lies become so loud in my brain. And I was so grateful for like Debbie and Jeanette and Chris and Laura, some other women in my life who were saying, no, this is a lie. That's not from the Lord, or these men were wrong, or this situation is not the norm, or shouldn't be the norm.
Yes. Okay. Do you mind telling me some of the specific messages you heard, or some of the lies that you really had to combat?
I don't necessarily only think it's just because I happen to be a woman, but I also happen to be a brown woman. And so a lot of the times, marginalized women um, do get gaslighted a lot. They do get told things in a different way. And not to say that white women don't experience the same situations, but there is proof and stats that women of
Mm.
color do tend to get are not very heard or unseen, and their voices are not as valuable, especially Black women in our community. And so that is really sad
Mm.
and unfortunate that I've experienced that. Some of the things that I've heard is my age. Sometimes, I'm shorter and I don't look my age. And so that's a great thing, but also when you're faced with certain people, it's not the
Sure.
best thing because they think, oh, how old are you? And so I've been questioned a lot about my age, like, how old are you? And I tell my son, don't ever ask your teacher how old she is, don't ever ask her, because I'm like, it's so, it's
Mm.
just kind of know that you don't really ask a woman how old she is. But some men have like pressured and like asked and asked. Another thing has been, like, I talked to some people about my health and just my journey with COVID, and some men have felt okay to talk about my health and question my health, and even give me some health advice, and really offend my dignity, and that's been offensive. And other things have just been, just questioning, how long have I been doing ministry? What do I know about ministry? Or even sometimes people's body language, just looking at me up and down, and you can immediately sense that that they're just like, oh, I didn't think you were the leader. Or I've been with my teammates and they naturally think that the other women are the leaders except for me. And thankfully, my coworkers are very kind, and they're like, oh, this is Janet, she's our team leader, and they give me my place. And that's been really helpful with like Debbie and Jeanette, to really always acknowledge. Even recently, we were in an elevator, we were going in, and I was with Jeanette, her husband, and a few other people. And I just kind of naturally got into this little corner just because of how everybody got into the elevator. And she made sure to scoot and say, this is Janet, and pointed at me. And that's just super valuable because, again, a lot of women of color tend to get marginalized, pushed aside, or unheard, and unvoiced. And so just acknowledging, the fact that, and I tend to be a little quieter and more reserved until I get to know somebody. And so just the fact that someone's like, oh, this is who she is, and then the people she introduced me were like, "Oh, I didn't even see that you were there," and it was like, yeah, I get that a lot, so just experiencing those things creates these lies of like, I'm not seen, I'm not valuable, I'm not good enough for this. Like, why would God want to use me, in such a big thing like this, and it's just not true. The Lord, so many stories in the Bible really are what encourages me. I love Hagar's story of how the Lord, sought after her. And then she's one of the first people who ever saw him, and she said, she named him after that. And it was the first time we see in the Bible God's name, because he saw her. And I love that story because I just resonate with it so much. Not only was she a marginalized woman, but also he saw her and validated her situation and where she was coming from. And that's just so beautiful. And then, of course, just so many other women that we don't tend to hear about. And we hear about, the leadership and the strength of the men in the Bible, which of course is great. But then we see the strength and the beauty of so many unnamed women, right, in the Bible. And I really desire for teenagers and young women, especially, to see that the Lord sees them, values and cares for them just deeply, names them, like the woman who bled for 12 years. He turns around and calls her daughter. Like, how beautiful is that, right?
Yes.
And that was a big thing, right? Because he pointed out to someone that was considered definitely marginalized, unwanted, uncared for, and he calls her daughter, and he was a rabbi, right? So to even acknowledge her was like beautiful. And I have to be reminded of those things constantly. And I'm so grateful for women like Debbie and Jeanette and all these other women that God has placed in my life who remind me of those truths, because I experience these things, unfortunately, from, other believers, but it's just the nature of sin in our world. And they remind me of the truth of Jesus and the word and what God says.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much for elaborating on that for us. I think it's really important for us to hear that and to be able to champion those around us.
Thank you. So we began to think outside of the box and think, how can we raise money in non-traditional ways that, normally we're taught to do in our ministry. And so Jeanette had this idea that she was using in a different circumstance, which is 1,000 women campaign. And with Debbie, we morphed it into this in seeking 1,000 women to give $100 within 2 years to prayerfully raise $100,000. And the money is for scholarships and for the food that we give teenagers, because, teenagers eat a lot at the campuses that we go to. And so currently here in Houston, we're at 8 campuses, and at 8 of those campuses in 4 or 5 major districts. And potentially in the fall, we'll be at 11 campuses. And what that means is that we help students, either a student or a coach or a teacher, establish a Cru club, or we come alongside a club that already exists and we help them develop ways that they can see their campus as a mission field. We started saying, will you consider looking at your high school as a 9-month mission field? You go to school for 9 months and you're thinking about it as a way to reach your campus. So not just developing this club of youth and Christian students, but really seeking out, students who are seeking faith or learning or desiring to learn, to figure out what is that void in their heart that needs to be filled. And so we partner with other people. We don't do this on our own because we don't have a lot of staff. And so we partner with other teachers, we partner with other volunteers, youth leaders who will walk alongside of us. And so, of course, we need funds to do that, to be able to give the students snacks and drinks. And then we also develop small group Bible studies. Like you said earlier, Cru's mission is to win, build, and send, right? And so we build students through small group discipleships, Bible studies, and then we equip them and send them like to conferences and to missions. And so that's the other reason we need scholarships. We also, are trying to get more apprentices, like I talked about Isaac, to be able to come alongside of us while they're in college. And that way they don't have to focus on raising their support. We pay them to join us to do some of the same ministry that we do. That and to equip and give to schools who maybe already have a club a Christian club. We're not interested in them changing their name into Cru. We just want to walk alongside of them. So we resource them. So that's another thing that we use. So we started the 1000 Women campaign and developed it with Debbie and Jeanette into this really great thing. We launched it in November of last year, and the Lord has been good. We've raised some funds from that already, that has been able to help students with the scholarships for this coming conference that we're having, and it's an ongoing 2 years. So one of the reasons we also did that is because we felt that $100 was a little bit more doable. I think about the family that I came from, my community. Even $100 can be a lot of money for some people, right? And of course, you're not limited to giving 100. You could give way more than that. We definitely love it, but we felt that that was doable for some people to say, oh yeah, I can give $100 for 2 years, and so that's how we developed this campaign.
Great. I'll be sure to put a link in the show notes to that campaign so people can find out more, and also just about your ministry in Houston. That will be really fun. And I'm sure you accept money from men as well. Is that right?
Of course, yes. Yeah, the name really, we debated into like, should we call it 1,000 Women campaign?
Yes.
And mostly we did because we're a team of women, and we decided
Yes.
to also, say, oh, this is who we are, but we accept from everyone, the money from men and women.
That is fantastic. Are there any other things that you would like to make sure that you let us know before we off here? Any other stories or insights that you have that you'd like to give us today?
Two stories. One of this young woman who went to our conference, one of our winter conferences this past January, and we talked a lot about forgiveness there. And I was just saying that when she came home, she joined our Bible study, and then she told us at Bible study that she wrote a letter to her dad, forgiving him for not being in her life all these years that she didn't really have a relationship with him. And so that was just such a step of action and faith that she took, knowing that it might not evolve into a lot, but just that she wanted to really take that step of forgiveness towards her dad was massive. And then, this young woman that wrote this letter to me, and I'll just read a couple of sentences because it's a little long, but she says, "Dear Miss Janet, I wanted to say thank you so much for everything. You are someone I look up to and even see as a second mom. Thank you for allowing me to express myself without me feeling any judgment coming from you. Thank you for always listening to me when I don't have anyone else to talk to. You always have given me the best advice, and I have always made sure that I felt okay and felt heard. I truly say this from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much. Every time I'm with you, I'm either smiling or laughing, or if I wanted to be vulnerable, you never judged me for that. When I was struggling, you did not hesitate to help me in any way you could. You have taught me so much, and you have shown me the love that nobody else has shown me." And she goes on to just, say some other sweet, kind things. Really, when I read it, I was in a season of feeling like, do any of these kids really enjoy being with me? Have I impacted anyone in my life? And then the Lord just sends me this sweet letter. It's just an affirmation of what other students have said to me. And again, it's not about me because it shouldn't be, but just that I would be a vessel for the Lord to use me in the lives of these young women is just humbling and encouraging and motivating. And I just want to be able to show them who Jesus is, and to be able to tell them that Jesus is their source of life and their source of joy, and the one that could give them the satisfaction that they need. And so reading that just really helped me to solidify, that my calling of where the Lord has me is where I need to be, and which was super encouraging. So yeah, I would say I also need to be reminded, I'm sure Debbie does too, and probably you do too, Ellen, of just, what we're doing is an eternal value, but it feels sometimes like it's just so hard and draining. Or, when I have circumstances like trying to raise money, or I face certain people who are not the kindest, you think, I don't think I should be doing this. But then you're reminded wow, this is so much more valuable than the money someone could give me or the struggles that someone could say to me. So it's the sacrifice is definitely worth it.
That's great. And it seems like there's a common theme here of that idea that God sees us and loves all people. He is good. What I love about the stories you shared is that you have been seen by God yourself, and then now you're able to impart that to these wonderful students that you get to serve for the Lord. So
Mm,
I just love that, and it's so valuable.
yeah.
One thing I was reading this morning was from Colossians 1, and Paul says basically that he wants to bring the gospel to everyone, the good news about Jesus, so that they will fully mature in Christ or be complete in Christ. And he says, to this end, I strenuously contend with
Mm,
all the energy Christ so powerfully works in me. That's Colossians 1:29. And that would be my prayer for you all, that you would just be able to continue to contend. It's
mm,
fighting, it's a battle, but with that energy that Christ so powerfully gives you, it's just so evident that he's at work in you. So thank you so much for all you're
yeah.
doing and just giving your life to him to be able to serve others and make such a difference.
Thank you for your time, Ellen. Thank you, Debbie, for your time too, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm really
Mhm.
humbled and excited about what
Yeah.
the Lord will do.
Well, thanks so much for being on the show today. And I'll look forward to Sunday meeting you in person, both of you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. This is Ellen Bennett with the Extraordinary Lives Podcast.